So, welcome to everyone. I am glad to introduce our lecture and discussion series in Digital Interculturality. I'm very excited about this day because we have been working a lot for it, and we really hope that it will be an interesting process we will do together. So you are, we will be very happy if you can turn on your camera, so at least now we can see each other. If you have a technical problem, that's obviously okay, but otherwise it will be really great to just see, have the feeling to be in the same place. We are not, but we are digitally connected. And we are here from very different countries, for example, Cuba, Brazil, the UK, maybe also someone from Ethiopia registered, so maybe is a person already here. So we are an international group, not just in the ReDICo team, but the whole group now of the lecture series. We are an interdisciplinary group, not just in the ReDICo team, but here in this big room where we are together. In this big group, is a characteristic is also the fact that we have students joining from different universities and countries, but also scientists from different research projects and in general universities and disciplines. We have also practitioners with us. So it's kind of an interesting mix, which maybe in the first part of this day, it won't count very much because we have a speaker who will tell us many interesting things. But in the second part, it will be very, very interesting because we can really get in touch with other people sitting very far away and maybe having different perspectives. And the idea of our ReDICo series is to bring people from different places and who have different backgrounds together and exchange together on topics which are today more than ever very relevant. In this lecture series, we talk about the divisions, about how the digital can foster division, polarization, but also about how the digital can help us to come together, promoting also intercultural dialogue. So I hope, and we hope as a ReDICo team, that you will enjoy it with us. We hope you can come with us in the whole process, but even if you skip one lecture, you're invited to join as much as you can. If you have wishes and needs, let us know per email. We are always at your disposal. Now, the lecture is organized by ReDICo. I said that many times. So ReDICo is a project funded by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research. Maybe, Carmen, you can change the slide. Thank you. So you have here some of the logos of the universities, or the logos of the universities involved. If you saw advertisement, you saw more logos than these 3 universities, because the lecturers who are going, the persons who are going to give a lectures in the next sessions are part of the team of the ReDICo team, but also are external researchers who are joining us from University of Urbino, for example, for the University of Limerick, from the University of Wien. So we have tried to create also a diverse input for you, and we hope it will be a great path together. So this today is the first session. Next slide, please. Of 8. We thought of finishing before the end of December, so 2023. We do it all very concentrated. You know already the program, so I won't look at it in detail. But the interesting thing is, in the next slide, that we have asynchronous sessions. That is, you are invited to go on our local campus room. Maybe you have already been there. And for every session we have live, we have chosen some other presentations which have been given in past conferences which we organized as ReDICo project, which are related to the presentations we hold live, so that you can deep into the concept, into that thematic area. And then you are invited to join the forum. So you can watch, you can go into the local campus as a guest, but if you want to join the forum, you should register, which is very, very easy. So the idea of the forum is to open up a possibility for you and for us to exchange with each other, and we invite for every deep in session, we invited also the researcher who presented the presentation we have been recording and you will maybe look at, to join also the forum. So we have 1 week in which you have the possibility to get into this unit, this deep in session, look at the presentation, which they're usually around 20 minutes, and discuss in the forum. So if you have, as I said, any questions, just contact us. If you have any technical issue, you can contact us here in the chat. Carmen Pereira is there in particular there for you, but otherwise everyone with this background can support you. Okay, so we are coming to the last slide. In this last slide, we have a name in the middle, which is Fergal Lenehan. Fergal Lenehan is one of the founders of ReDICo project. He's a researcher who has engaged with intellectual history and cultural studies since acquiring his initial undergraduate degrees at University College Dublin. Then he moved to Leipzig, where he had his PhD, and then to Jena for his Habilitation, which is something very specifically German. We could say it's a sort of postdoctoral qualification. I would not say more about Fergal Lenehan. You will discover a lot about him thanks to this presentation. He has been working a lot on. He wants to present something original, and he will certainly do it. He will lead us in the world of intercultural new media studies and look at it under a critical perspective. Above all, using the perspective of post-digitality and cosmopolitanism. Maybe for some of you are terms which you cannot associate with anything. Above all, post-digitality is a term which is quite new. But the nice thing is that in some minutes, you will know very much about that. So stay with us for the presentation and stay with us after that when we can really try to make sense of what we have heard. So thank you, Fergal, and have fun. You and we all. Us all.
Okay, thank you, Louisa. Okay, thank you very much. Then, yeah, so today I want to talk about intercultural new media studies, an orientation that I suppose developed in the United States around 2012. And I want to then go on from here and talk about post-digitality, okay, how we're sort of reacting. Everybody here within the lecture and discussion series is reacting, I suppose, to the idea of post-digitality, about what this can be. And I'm reacting to this in relation to the idea of post-digital cosmopolitanism, okay? Yeah, so firstly, I want to tell you the structure of what I'm going to do today. Yeah, firstly, I want to talk about intercultural new media studies. From my perspective, we would like to build on and advance actually intercultural new media studies, but we prefer, for a number of reasons, to see this, we prefer to see this framed differently, okay, and to be informed by a sort of a varied series of theoretical texts. And for this reason, we want to talk about a ubiquitous digital interculturality, okay? I would argue here for the incorporation of 3 series of theoretical texts, and I think there's more sort of ideas coming from my colleagues, but I would argue here that post-digitality is important here, platformization as well as German intercultural theory. Post-digitality is basically the idea that the dichotomy between new and old media doesn't make sense anymore, in the same way that the dichotomy between the digital and the material doesn't make sense anymore. That these are things that are intermingled and intertwined, and in the sense that new media aren't new anymore, and so-called old media, the sort of the implicit other actually of intercultural new media studies, are not old, but have actually taken on a different form. From my perspective, platformization is a very important idea, and the platformization view of the internet is also key here from my perspective anyway. Intercultural new media studies writes in terms of platforms, but a lot has changed actually since intercultural new media studies was developed between the years 2012 and 2017. The internet has changed completely and now should be seen as what I would call a patchwork of platforms, which actually represent a bounding and a bordering of the internet. Platformization is also inherently post-digital, as it represents actually an intermingling of the digital and the material, and also changes the life world. And I suppose the classic example here is Amazon, that has, to a certain extent, changed the face of capitalism. And other platforms as well, of course, but I'll go into this in more detail in a few minutes. Intercultural new media studies is also something that's very Anglophone, actually. That comes from the area of communications theory, especially in the United States, and we would see here a sort of a further extension of theory to be very, very useful, not least the incorporation of German intercultural theory, as this theoretical approach has actually been read too little outside of Germany, we would argue, and it also offers something very, very interesting in relation to the concepts of culture and culturality, interculture and interculturality. Okay, and my, I suppose, specific perspective here is to view this from the perspective of post-digital cosmopolitanism as an approach to post-digitality. And from here, I will offer concrete arguments about how this can be done. The advantages here, from my perspective, are that post-digital cosmopolitan approach is very context-oriented. Okay, it borrows widely from a vast degree of different areas. And it is actually a more complex approach to the clouded agency of the internet than that which is sort of communicated by the dominating paradigm of intercultural communication, I would argue. Okay, but firstly, what actually is intercultural new media studies? According to Bruce Mutsvero and Susanna Salgado in the Oxford Bibliographies, the sort of online source for communication studies, intercultural new media studies refers to scholarly attempts to fathom ways through which ICTs, information and communication technologies, new media, and digital technologies in general relate to and affect intercultural communication. Robert Schutte is sort of the main theorist, the main initiator of intercultural new media studies. And for him, intercultural new media studies, according to Mutsvara and Salgado, it goes beyond the more common studies of how new media is appropriated and used in different cultures and how cultures affect the new media development. Its main focus is on how new media impacts intercultural communication between both individuals and groups in different contexts. In other words, these studies are mostly concerned with the ways in which new media affect and shape communication between users who do not share a cultural background. Schutte himself began, I suppose, and created, I suppose, intercultural new media studies with a text from 2012, which was called Intercultural New Media Studies, the Next Frontier in Intercultural Communication. So Schutte must be a fan of Star Trek by the sounds of things. And this was a text that appeared in the Journal of Intercultural Communication Research in 2012. According to himself, he is conceptualizing the parameters of a new field of inquiry called Intercultural New Media Studies, which consists of two areas: one, new media and intercultural communication theory, and two, culture and new media. And according to Schutte, in this text, intercultural new media studies explores the intersection of how new media and intercultural communication theory has the potential to refine and expand 20th century theories of intercultural communication grounded in the face-to-face paradigm. And that's fair enough. This is a good idea. This sort of the face-to-face paradigm is of course only one facet of the vast complexity of intercultural communication. So the central idea here is sound and definitely worthwhile reading. Within this text, Schurter offers 13 theoretical implications of ICTs for intercultural theory, and he orients these around 4 different areas, namely cultural identity, intercultural dialogue, and third culture, acculturation, and intercultural competence. And these theoretical implications really raise questions, and he emphasizes how a lot of these questions that have been raised haven't been answered, while not really sort of offering answers himself. This is Robert Schurter from his Wikipedia page. In 2017, Schurter basically published the same text again, slightly advanced and slightly different, and this time called Intercultural New Media Studies, still the next frontier in intercultural communication. And this appeared in a handbook, a very large handbook called Intercultural Communication, which was edited by Ling Chen. And here, Schurter argues that this area, intercultural new media studies, focuses on how ICTs impact theories of communication between people who do not share the same cultural backgrounds, often defined as national culture, nation state, and co-culture, i.e. ethnicity and race, to use Schurter's words, in early intercultural communication research, but expanded contemporarily to include myriad cultures, but within and across geopolitical boundaries, as well as hybridized cultures that have developed transnationally due to migration, diaspora, and time and space reconfigurations in a digital age. And I would have, I suppose, a number of critiques of intercultural new media studies. And I think there's a number of ways upon which we can build upon this, upon these ideas. The first critique would be of culturalism. Okay, the word culture appears an awful lot here, which draws a lot of red lights in a lot of people's brains. And the idea here that there are already formed ideas of what a culture is and where that is to be found. There is a certain danger here of creating and finding something which you have already decided at the very, very start of your research exists. So I think a critique of culturalism can have a certain validity. Intercultural new media studies often appears to be actually cross-cultural and comparative rather than intercultural in essence. He's talking a lot about new media and people from different cultural contexts and what they do with it as a result, rather than sort of the messy area of interculturality itself, I would argue at least. What you have here in intercultural new media studies is actually a very strong dichotomy. And a double dichotomy, actually a dichotomy between the digital and the organic world, or the digital and material world, and a dichotomy between old and implicitly between, because if there is something called new media, there's something called old media, and I would question whether that is still actually valid, this dichotomy, and actually I think it's not. And one area which is undeveloped in intercultural new media studies is the area of platforms in relation to questions of power. Schurter does talk about platforms, okay, but this whole idea that the power of platforms and the agental power that they have is something that isn't really fully formed within intercultural new media studies. Okay, so as a result, I suppose then we suggest instead the study of digital interculturality, or the study of digital interculturality studies. And with this in mind, we have already founded a new book series called Studies in Digital Interculturality, edited by Luisa Conti, Milene Mendez de Oliveira, Roman Leitz, and myself. And the first book in this series will be published actually at the end of February, but I'll talk to you more about that in a few minutes. Okay, but one of the central aspects of digital interculturality as we would approach it, okay, and we're still sort of approaching it and we're still sort of developing these sort of central ideas is the importance of digitality and the importance of the post-digital theoretical discussion. And this is actually quite a complex theoretical discussion that has been ongoing really since 2014. And central here is the idea of the complete normalization of digitality, that the digital is only really noticed anymore when it's not there, as well as the idea that the digital and the analog have become completely interwoven, that it doesn't really make sense to talk about a dichotomy between the digital and the analog anymore, as these things have become completely interwoven, not least with apps and with mobile phones and with the centrality of platforms in many aspects of daily life. This theoretical debate has been ongoing, especially in the journal Post-Digital Science and Education, but in other places too. And this debate was really kicked off properly and formally really by the German theorist Florian Kremer, who is based in the Netherlands, with his text, What is Post-Digital, from 2014. And here he argues that the post-digital is continued digitalization. Okay, it's not the end of the digital at all, far from it. It's the advancement of the digitalization, but digitalization is now marked by subtle cultural shifts and ongoing mutations. Post-digitality, he believes, describes the messy state of media, art, and design after their digitization, or at least the digitization of crucial aspects of the channels to which they are communicated. And post-digitality is the disruption brought about by digital information technology, which has already occurred. And one of Kramer's main bugbears is the idea that there's something called new media, basically. And he argues that actually the idea of post-digitality and the theoretical series of texts eradicates the distinction between the old and new media in theory as well as in practice, because new media has been incorporated into old media. Newspapers haven't died away, but their form has changed. And from his perspective, that it makes no sense to talk about a dichotomy between old and new media. What we have is things changing and rather than things dying out necessarily, according to Kramer anyway. And this post-digital debate has been carried on and developed in a lot of different directions, actually. So for example, Berry and Dieter, they talk about the post-digitality being the idea that digital disruption becomes routine. They talk about the idea of ubiquitous digitalization. Berry writes about how being online or being offline is now anachronistic with our always-on smart devices. How the post-digital is hegemonic and as such is entangled with everyday life and experience in a highly complex, messy, and difficult to untangle way that is different from previous instantiations of the digital, he argues. And Knox, on the other hand, points out how the post-digital recognizes the ways that such technology is already embedded in and entangled with existing social practices and economic and political systems. Okay, and just to summarize, excuse me, this theoretical discussion. So the idea is here that literally that digital media are not new anymore. The idea is present here that the old and new media dichotomy, that the digital and analog dichotomy are both redundant. That our life worlds have become entangled with ubiquitous and hegemonic digitalization. And the term hegemonic here is also important, that often it is difficult to exist outside of the post-digital world because so many aspects and practices like going to the bank and doing different things have moved onto platforms and moved onto different situations. And if you have difficulties with this, it can have a hegemonic quality and it can result in difficulties in your life. Okay, and the fact that our life worlds are entangled with ubiquitous hegemonic digitalization also means actually that our life worlds have become entangled with a variety of economic, political, and social systems. Okay, and these systems are communicated generally via platforms in the present age. And this is another perspective that I think definitely needs to be incorporated in relation to the study of digital interculturality. And I think we need to change how we view the internet in a very sort of radical way. It's no longer the internet, what used to be an internetwork of networks, but it is no longer this, and this sense of freedom that it communicated there is no longer there, actually. I would argue that it now has to be seen as a patchwork of platforms entangled with various, often clouded agental shards. And a shard is a very small piece of something, often a very small piece of glass within a sort of a floor covered in pieces of glass. And I would argue that platforms are covered with different types of agental shards, different types of agency. And this agency can mold communication via platforms to various and often radical extents. Platforms, of course, we deal with platforms in our daily lives. There are a variety of different platforms. You have obviously social media platforms, marketplace platforms, financial services platforms. You have also, of course, gig economy platforms like Uber and Airbnb. And Google, of course, is the platform of platforms, I suppose, as well as streaming platforms. According to the Dutch media theorist Ten Uyver, what he talks about the internet architecture imaginary. And he sees here a radical change in terms of what the internet architectural imaginary is. In the early 90s, you still had sort of a residue of cyber utopianism, the idea that the internet was an engine for innovation and an information highway and a tool for democratization was very, very, very present. Whereas now he argues that the internet is a site of contestation. It's an assemblage of power. And obviously, I suppose platforms to a certain extent have been dominated by US platforms. We can think of Google and Facebook and Amazon, or platforms at least with their roots in the USA. But of course, you also have a variety of platforms, and you have a variety of local internets. And very many, of course, platforms you could view as being central platforms in relation to digital capitalism. And many people have also talked about platformization as being the third globalization, but you also have, of course, also non-economic platforms. The first person to talk about platforms or to write about platforms in this way was Gillespie in 2010, where he here looked at the development of the term itself and how platforms themselves began to describe themselves as platforms. I suppose looking at YouTube, he looks at firstly, and he talks here about how the term itself was vague enough to work across multiple venues for multiple reasons. Hall, Nieborg, and Dieck have defined platforms as reprogrammable digital infrastructures that facilitate and shape personalized interactions among end users and complementors, organized through the systematic collection, algorithmic processing, monetization, and circularization of data. And for me, the key word here is shape, that personalized interactions are also shaped by platforms. Platformization, the three authors, the same three authors, view in two different manners, okay? Firstly, from the perspective of software studies, business studies, and political economy, they view platformization as the penetration of the infrastructures, economic processes, and governmental frameworks in different economic sectors and spheres of life. Okay, so platformization is here, is relates to how platforms have become central actually to economic processes, at times to governmental processes, to administrative processes. And in terms of cultural studies, they talk about platformization as the reorganization of culture, practice, and imaginations around platforms. I think we can instantly come up with a number of different examples of how cultural practice has changed because of platforms. One thing, of course, is the whole idea of dating apps and how dating apps have influenced certain types of contact in certain contexts, which would have been completely unimaginable, I think, 20 years ago. Mark Davis has written very interestingly on Amazon, actually, and reading culture and what he calls the neoliberal logics of platform capitalism. He talks here about the cultural and how cultural and aesthetic practices are being reordered under the platformization of culture in 5 different ways. So he talks about here what he calls resorting, how platforms have now taken on sort of a cultural mediation role, that the old sort of cultural gatekeepers have less power, okay? He talks about transmutation, how platform logics can also change form, how different he talks about how different rap songs have become now shorter because it's easier to download sort of shorter forms. He talks about enclosure, how new practices have come onto the market. He talks as well, of course, about surveillance as foundation activity of many platforms, about collecting data, and he talks here about capture, how the idea that platforms want to keep you on their platform for as long as possible. And of course, when we're talking about platforms, we're not just talking about US or Western platforms. So for example, Davis and Choi talk about the need to re-regionalize platform studies. And they do this by talking basically about the most dominant platforms in China. And of course, there is a danger here that you're just creating sort of two poles of dominance here. One is Western platforms, and often sort of US platforms are seen as Western platforms, and it's also sort of a bit problematic. And then this is sort of counterpointed to Chinese platforms. And but there is definitely sort of room for more research in relation to the different intranets and the different types of platform worlds which now exist. Julie E. Cohn has come up with has written a very interesting book on platforms. She's a legal theorist and comes with a very interesting perspective. So she talks about how a platform or platforms are sites of encounter where interactions are materially and algorithmically intermediated. Okay. And again, she talked about how the idea of an open network of network, how this networks, the old idea of the internet is now redundant, okay, is no longer has any validity. But platforms for her are infrastructure-based strategies for introducing friction into networks, for bounding networks and privatizing and controlling structures. And here we have the idea of platforms as borders, as forms of inclusion and exclusion, which goes very much counter to the early idea of the internet as an open network of networks. But of course, as Cohn also writes, platforms are also sites, or can also be sites of collective meaning, where people can easily find and connect with each other, with others who have similar interests, and they can also be sites in which new forms of collective meaning making take place, with new capacities for rapid organization of mass protests. And the book by Paulo Gaboida, Tweets on the Street, is an interesting dissection of how this can take place in relation to mass protests. And he talks here chiefly about the Arab Spring. Okay, then to summarize in relation to platformization, yeah, I would definitely argue that the internet is not an open network of networks anymore. Okay, as loads of people have argued, but now should be seen as a patchwork of platforms built upon various and often clouded gentle shards. Platformization is also inherently post-digital. Okay, platforms such as Uber, such as Airbnb, such as Amazon also have very real material consequences, and there is sort of a deep intertwining here between the material and the digital. They're also a bounding of the internet, a sort of a bordering of the internet, and they also represent an intermediation of interaction. So platforms are also, of course, potential sites of collective meaning making and meaningful connection. Okay, and coming on to, I suppose, the third critique of intercultural new media studies and how I suppose we want to bring this further a bit. We would argue that, yeah, intercultural new media studies, I would argue anyway, is very Anglophone, and that there is a lot there in terms of intercultural theory, which could be useful in terms of fleshing out these ideas. So, for example, the German media theorist and media historian Sigrid Zelensky defines media as spaces of action for constructed attempts to connect what is separated. And if you look at the logic of intercultural new media studies, what they called, okay, they basically create a dichotomy as well between what they call new media and how new media affects processes of intercultural communication. And maybe this logic in itself is also inherently wrong, in that it is maybe logical to view all media, both new and old, actually as sites of interculturality, as constructed attempts to connect what is separated, as Zelensky describes. German intercultural theory also has actually probably a more complex understanding of culturality and interculturality. And we would here especially refer to our former colleague and friend, Jürgen Bolton, who died recently, and his work. So, for example, in the book, which is forthcoming in 2024, Bolton talks about culturality as unquestioned relevance, plausibility, and rule formation. Okay, whereas interculturality he sees as the uncertain, the unfamiliar, and the fluid. Okay, so interculturality appears here, I suppose, as a state, almost as a feeling, I suppose. And according to Bolton, then our life and our relationships our constant movement between structure, being culture, culturality, and process being interculturality and the unfamiliar. So, for example, in a 2020 text, Jorgen Bolton writes that because of the multiplicity of identities, a relationship between two people can be marked by both interculturality and culturality, and that these phases can actually sort of go into each other and interconnect in different ways. And he's talking about two people, okay, who work together. And he writes that they are predominantly socialized in different contexts, meaning that they grew up in different countries, I suppose. But in a common, e.g. professional context of action, they have certainly been able to develop common conventions, plausibility, and rules of normality, so that the interculturality of this cooperation in this context has meanwhile already crossed the fluid boundary to culturality. Okay, and the complexity of this movement this constant movement between culturality and interculturality is in many contexts, so complex that it cannot really be mapped in any meaningful way, except maybe in a very micro level. And according to Bolton, basically we need to accept the complexity of this actually, and also avoid culturalizations. So according to Louisa Conti, in a forthcoming book from 2024, which I'll talk about again at the end, she writes that interculturality occurs increasingly, okay, interculturality meaning here the uncertain, the unfamiliar, the fluid. It occurs increasingly within familiar contexts due to intensifying dynamics of change. And the digital space today plays a pivotal role in shaping interculturality and spreading sort of the unfamiliar. But of course, the online world, the internet, can also be used strategically for cultivating intercultural competence. So she argues here that the digital space can have a bridging function actually between interculturality and culturality, making the unfamiliar, making the strange familiar. I suppose we would argue here then that the internet is also actually a space of hyper interculturality, a constant stream of inclusionary and exclusionary processes, and a constant movement from the unfamiliar to the familiar. And I said earlier that this is difficult to map, maybe in sort of micro studies. And we have, for example, two very interesting micro studies, also part of the 2024 book, so by Milene Mendes de Oliveira and Mario Antonio Tecello, Roman Leitz and Magdalena Laska, and both studies very, very interestingly map actually this movement within very specific digital contexts. Okay, so to summarize what I talked about here, the internet is also I would argue a post-digital, we would argue a post-digital site or post-digital sites of hyper interculturality, of hyper unfamiliarity, encroaching actually upon the familiar. But it is also a site on which interculturality is constantly becoming culturality. Okay, so it has these two sides. Okay, and yeah, my specific viewpoints that I want to discuss more specifically today relates to post-digital cosmopolitanism and how post-digital cosmopolitanism may also be an approach to digital interculturality. So Christoph Barmeier and Dominic Busch in the recent book Meilensteine der Interkulturalitätsforschung, they argue in the introduction, or they state in the introduction, and they're talking about here interculturality, not in the Bolton sense, but in the general sense that it is meant, of course, in intercultural communication studies. And this is translated from the German. So that the term interculturality is used to describe the process of mutual comprehension among people who belong to different cultures who ascribe to themselves and to each other different identities that are marked as culturally singular. And this is, I suppose, is the dominant paradigm of intercultural communications, the idea that It is about person A meeting person B, and from that you have something sort of messy but interesting called interculture C. And then the question is, okay, is this also valid for the hypermediated online interactions with very complex, partly agential realities, well beyond person A meets person B? Because person A meets person B, they do use technology. Okay, you can use obviously language as a type of media and a symbolic system as a type of technology. And this is also true for gestures, but the limits of the media world is relatively limited. And of course, you do have your power relations as well. Obviously, person A maybe can speak the chosen language better than person B, etc., which we've all encountered and we have all studied. Okay, but as I said, I would see the internet as a patchwork of platforms built upon various, often clouded agential shards. Okay, so these platforms, you have pieces of agency, you have agential shards all over the place. Okay, you can see these agential shards in the very material, structural, and algorithmic mediation of platforms. Okay, so algorithms push us to meet some people rather than other people, push us to read some texts or watch some things rather than other things. The structure of platforms shape how we communicate when acting on them. And there are other very, very real material sort of mediations in platforms themselves, not least hardware. Okay, the hardware that we have and hardware that other people have, which might get broken or might need to be updated, etc. There's also a sort of an agential shard, I would argue. And there are also, of course, very practical inclusion exclusionary processes going on here when we're talking about the internet. We haven't talked at all about the digital divide, the fact that very large numbers of people, of course, are excluded from internet usage. This is a very, very clear reality and a very, very material and clear process of inclusion and exclusion. But you also have people with unsteady internet. You have people whose internet doesn't work, etc., etc. Not least if we are interacting on platforms, then yeah, the person A to person B interaction maybe becomes person A to person A to Z, if you know what I mean. That, okay, you may think you're talking with, if you're person A, you may think you're talking with person B, but maybe person B isn't quite the person you think they are. Not only that, maybe person C, D, E, and F are also on that platform and lurking and looking at your conversation. And maybe person H, I, and J might dive in and also join in the conversation, maybe insult you, maybe support you, who knows? And not least the platform that you're communicating on is using your communications as a form of data, and this is being fed into their system. And of course, we have ubiquitous post-digitality. So even if you are on a platform and you think you're talking to person B, but you're actually talking to person A to Z, within the material reality, you may also be person A, or person B might have their phone, and they might have a series of people around them who are also then engaging indirectly in the communication. And that's what I mean by this sort of more complex sort of patchwork of platforms with often clouded agential shards. That there's a lot of potential agency here, and an awful lot more than in the sort of the local, the usual paradigm that we talk of in intercultural communication. And okay, from my perspective, I think that the contextualized study of post-digital cosmopolitan flows in the life world might offer us an avenue to look at intercultural communication and to look at the new complexity of agency here, the agential shards, as I call it. Yeah, so okay, first question, okay, what is cosmopolitanism? Are we talking here about sophistication, the sort of the type of idea that is often sort of in circulation in more general discourse, that somebody is cosmopolitan if they've traveled a lot and they know a lot and that sort of thing? Or, you know, obviously there's the cocktail cosmopolitan, there is of course the magazine. But of course, if you go back to ancient Greek times, a cosmopolitan was theorized basically as somebody who was a citizen of the world. And if you, from my perspective anyway, if you break a cosmopolitan down into its central idea, the idea is here that there is more to existence than just the local context. It is sort of a consciousness of the non-local, the consciousness of an extended contextual reality. And I would argue actually that although the term cosmopolitanism itself is a Western term, it has roots in the intellectual history of ancient Greece, that this idea that there's more than just the local, that we're part of a bigger whole is probably an idea that is found in an awful lot of different world cultures. If we're looking at the intellectual history of the Western world, which I suppose is what I'm working in the intellectual reality in which most of us probably exist, then there have been sort of three main approaches to cosmopolitanism from an academic perspective. One is the normative philosophical cosmopolitanism, probably which we're most familiar with. The second is a descriptive approach, and the third is a processual approach. I want to talk about these three approaches now. So the normative political philosophical approach is probably the one that we're most familiar with, or even if you've never really read much about cosmopolitanism, maybe you know about the ancient Greek ideas, or you've heard about Immanuel Kant or his ideas of cosmopolitanism, or maybe you've come across Kwame Anthony Appiah and his very good book, Cosmopolitanism: Ethics in a World of Strangers. I suppose the center of this type of philosophical thinking is the idea of worldness. Okay, the idea that we aren't just local, that we're of the world, but there are also sort of orientations here which are maybe democratically oriented, actually. And you do as well have often an ethics-based critique of national structures. And this discourse, there is an orientation within this discourse which looks to imagine sort of structures outside of the national. Then there is an empirical descriptive discourse here, and we're talking here about the describing the analysis and the explanation of wide cultural links and feelings of solidarity beyond the national and at times before the national, okay, often from a historical perspective. And here the historical and sociological perspective is dominant here. And maybe some of you have come across for example, the cosmopolitan sociology of Ulrich Beck will be one of an important figures here. And then we have a processual approach to cosmopolitanism, which sees cosmopolitanism actually as a moment of change, as a moment of change in outlook. And this approach looks at cosmopolitanism in terms of wider cultural transformations due to contact with others. And this is basically a sociological and cultural studies perspective, but it is more of a theoretical perspective, a social theoretical perspective. It's worth mentioning here George Delanty as well, who gave a keynote address at our conference in the summer, and his book, The Cosmopolitan Imagination, The Renewal of Critical Social Theory. So cosmopolitanism from this perspective examines forms of language, spaces, agents, and representations of various kinds leading to individual and collective transformations, and often seen as generally seen as positive and progressive. And what I would like to do in terms of using these ideas for engaging with digital interculturality is actually to map these three macro categories onto the post-digital, and to talk about post-digital cosmopolitanism. And we're talking here then about a type of normative philosophical post-digital cosmopolitanism. We're talking then about a type of descriptive, okay, empirical, everyday post-digital cosmopolitanism. And we can also talk here about a type of processual post-digital cosmopolitanism, I would argue. And when we're talking here about normative philosophical post-digital cosmopolitanism, we're talking here really about ways of rethinking the internet, ways of reimagining how the internet can work. And a key text here is the text actually called Digital Cosmopolitans, by Ethan Zuckerman, which looks actually at ways to rethink contact on the internet and to refine the serendipity, the sort of the sense of chance of chance encounters with somebody who we weren't expecting to meet. And central here is generally also sort of decentralization, the decentralization of power. in an internet context. And we're also talking here about the establishment of utopian spaces within the structure of the existing internet. When we're talking about utopia and the internet, we also have to, of course, mention Wikipedia, as Roman would emphasize. And Wikipedia is actually a massive non-economic utopian idea. And in the past year, of course, Mastodon has also been talked about as a platform in this sense, as a return to sort of an earlier idea of how the internet could be run outside of economic structures and in a more sort of cooperative sort of manner. Yeah, but of course, we also have empirical, everyday, post-digital cosmopolitanism, okay, the type of descriptive cosmopolitanism that we were talking about before. There was also a literature on this, which is maybe not quite digital, but it refers to some things which would also sort of fit in with the post-digital. And we're talking here about everyday cultural post-digital cosmopolitanism, which in the literature is also called banal cultural consumption or aesthetico-cultural cosmopolitanism. And we're talking about here about the Netflix effect, okay? And this is the type of cosmopolitanism which is maybe unconscious, is maybe banal, is maybe extraordinary, and it's definitely outside of elite culture, but it's also a relatively common practice. The idea that we can get images and videos and text from all over the world at a touch of a button, or that Netflix can entice us to look at a film from Norway or a series from Korea is here. And it's interesting that in the literature, this is usually seen in terms of banal cosmopolitanism as having very little effect. But if you look actually at the asynchronous lecture for this week by Chisholm, what is very, very important in Chisholm's research is that she has looked basically at this idea and has looked at has looked at the cosmopolitan consumption of students in a secondary school in Bremen, and actually found out that actually their interest in Korean pop and their interest in Korean videos has had a transformative effect. And it means that they're very, very interested in Asia. It means that they have actually ambitions where maybe otherwise they wouldn't have ambitions. And I would definitely recommend everybody to watch that lecture on YouTube during the week. And we're also talking here about everyday systematic post-digital cosmopolitanism, the idea of algorithmic platform and architectural structuring of the post-digital everyday, which can often have a very dominant effect on how we create our lives, okay? And the agental shards for this maybe are spread all over the world. And if we're talking here about this type of descriptive cosmopolitanism as looking at interactions, then this is a very, very important area to look at. And of course, you can also talk about a processual type of digital cosmopolitanism, which can take a benign and a non-benign form. And again, here we're talking about changes in outlook and wider cultural transformations due to contact with others. And maybe you could talk here about, for example, Black Lives Matter, how this started as a hashtag on Twitter. And then the hashtag became a movement, and then the movement inspired a whole series of digital text. And you can see, and then Black Lives Matter. Okay, there was at one stage there was a graffiti with Black Lives Matter outside the apartment here. You can see how this has had a sort of a cosmopolitan effect and a very sort of real world post-digital effect, where the material and the digital are very, very much intertwined. And maybe you could talk about the Me Too movement in relation to this as well. Maybe also about the Ich bin Hannah movement within German academia. Okay, about which there has already been a book, and I see I've misspelled Hannah here. And of course, you also have non-benign type of connections as well. And we can mention here, for example, 4chan, which is a platform upon which white nationalists and often internationalist thinking white nationalists have come to meet. And then this is also a type of cultural transformation due to contact with others. But unfortunately, this is something which has taken a non-benign form. Okay, and these are basically, I suppose, my central ideas in relation to post-digital cosmopolitanism and how they would relate to an approach to digital cosmopolitanism. And for the second part of the class, and I suppose we're conceiving this in terms of a class, what I want you to do is to everybody to think about, to take 5 minutes, okay, to think about and write down about how many post-digital cosmopolitan actions you partake in, and to think about how post-digital cosmopolitan are you in your daily life. And in order to inspire you to do this, I would like actually to read a short text. And if you want, you can close your eyes and just listen to the text. If you want, you can, if you don't find my voice too grating, that is. And if you want, you can read the text with me as well. It's a lot of text, okay, and it comes from an article I wrote a few years ago. And it basically describes the day of a fictitious character and the way in which this character is interconnected with a vast variety of agential shards, as I would call it. Okay. So Jan comes from Hamburg, but he lives in Leipzig. Over a light breakfast, he always checks the Twitter app on his phone and gets a selected overview of world news while going for a post-breakfast jog. The Strava app records his route, elevation, speed, and timing, and shares this automatically with Jan's Strava followers. Sometimes he listens to Spotify, sometimes he prefers not to. Jan works for a firm that produces vinyl, and he often answers emails from partners in Bangkok, Cape Town, and Melbourne. Currently, everyone at the company he is working from home. At 11 a.m. Every day, a work meeting takes place on Zoom. The employees are largely scattered around the city and join from the bedrooms and sitting rooms. Jan reads about the Bundesliga on the Guardian app and sometimes orders food from Lieferando for lunch. He edits Wikipedia articles in his free time in German and English. Every now and then, he is active on a Marvel Comics fan site. He used to write a blog called The Hamburger im Osten, a hamburger in the East, but gave this up 2 years ago. Jan plays internet chess at the weekend and buys books from Amazon based on Amazon's recommendations. He often gets into arguments with his friends in the local bar about pop culture trivia. They usually use Google on their phones to find the answer. One of his older friends has become estranged from the group because of his new radical politics. Jan has described him as lost to conspiracy theories. Jan himself is also politically active in environmental politics and often takes part in demonstrations via a Facebook group of which he is a member. These demonstrations include marches linked to the Fridays for Future group. He has been learning Dutch and Duolingo and finds it more difficult than he thought he would. He has also been watching the Squid Game on Netflix. He started watching it in Korean with German subtitles, but then changed the language settings to German. Before going to sleep, Jan generally checks Twitter. Mobile phone videos circulating online, such as one from Kabul airport showing some people falling to their death from an airplane, have meant in the past he sometimes finds it difficult to fall asleep. Okay, so again, I would ask everyone to take 5 minutes to think about your daily life, in these sort of terms, and to untangle the shards of post-digital cosmopolitan agency within which you exist. Okay.